finding out, trying to find out.
The difference between the example and the illustration is that first we're just asking straight for an example. Secondly, we want you to dig deeper and think of something more. And it could be in different forms. Some kids like to draw. Some like to, like I said, respond to poetry. Some people use an analogy. Some people just give another example. It's just to dig deeper.
But it all builds on the clarity of the definition of the concept or the idea or whatever you've got. So what would you do with my example of the child looking at the moon?
I would say that's an illustration. I would say if you could pull out, like with graphic art on a computer, you wanted to plug in an illustration to show us right here, you would say that illustrates a wondering mind being inspired by a phenomenon in the universe and wanting to get involved in learning about it. I would consider that an illustration.
Okay.
And an example before that would be a student taking a concept and on their own going home and saying, gee, that's exciting. Let me look into this idea of manifest destiny and see what other people, especially women maybe at that time when it was brought up, thought about it.
In terms of the second one, elaborating on the definition, what we say is put it in your own words for the younger groups. But if a student, even at a master's level, cannot put something in his own words, he doesn't understand. That's a really good, quick check for understanding.
And you might come from different points of view. Like with this one, there might be somebody, we've slightly seen it differently. And as long as a person tried to do it, I don't know that there's a definite answer. Depending on the statement, it's open to your own interpretation.
But you can always ask the student to justify their thinking.
Right.
You know,
right.
How did they get to that?
Or if it's unclear, well, what did you mean by peace in that statement? I don't understand how you're using the word peace as you point. You see what I mean? You could, because students often skate by with truncated, not clearly thought through answers. And that's a harm to them because we're not expecting them to exercise their brain. They get through school, you hear these kids in high school talking, you don't think they can do more than 4 words.
John, did you?
Yeah. I used, my elaboration was, it's not lining up facts, but rather capturing listeners' interest and drawing them in to emotionally embrace the educational opportunity before them. So an example is when I teach testing, I used to try to say, here's what the test, now let's look at the manual, and let's go through and memorize all the scales and figure out what they do, and let's get you ready. I found it's much better to just say, take the test, and now it's you. And suddenly people are much more concerned, and then I make them interpret somebody else's test. And again, in preparation for that, it's like, don't bother me with the facts. I have to learn something here, you know. But it's enormously more motivating than to just go through a linear kind of testing line or lecture line.
That makes sense.
Right. And you kind of built a little Velcro in their brain, so to speak, where now the facts that they need to take in or that you want to impart or share, they're inclined and open to seeing what makes it. Alfred North Whitehead, a great philosopher and educator, he called the first stage of learning romance, where you open up and get the student to kind of fall in love with wanting to know something. And then the second stage is precision. Well, how does that work? And they want to put it together. That would be like what John is talking about.
Mike.
Elaborate on that one. I would say that basically putting that in my own words is when you see the energy and the expression on people's face of what I would interpret them to be more open and eager, that would make movement towards something, and I would hear some words saying, gee, I really would like to know more of that.
Right.
And an example would, similar to what John's is, in consulting skills, I often tell students that one of the most frequent situations they'll find themselves in as an internal consultant is being asked to facilitate some sort of off-site meeting. And basically say, what do you think would go into that? So I'm trying to line up that this is something in a month or 2 or 3 months when I get on the job they're going to be be faced with, so it's relevant, it's
Right.
gonna happen,
Right.
and to start getting them prepared to wondering about what would they need to do and what would they need to learn and skills and knowledge to be able to pull that off. In an illustration, I just give them one that, a situation that I was confronted with oftentimes, and just, tell them more specifically what the issue was and the kind of thoughts that, how I thought about putting together with the potential client the
Oh, that's
structure of the
perfect.
meeting.
Yeah. Okay, great, that works.
Wow.
Anybody else?
Jerry, yeah.
Well, I had to think of it this way. A tale has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you're talking about education, you're not really talking about it ending.
Ah,
And you are kind of the spark and then throwing fuel in as you go. But the fuel you're throwing in is not the fire, but it becomes the fire. So it's that connection and disconnection. The example was, I guess, kind of it's in the area of lifelong learning. One of my doctoral students, she makes a living teaching old people. They're not just seasoned citizens, they're old people, teaching them how to use computers so they connect with their grandkids and communicate. It's lifelong, it's ongoing. These people don't want to spend the rest of their life rocking on the porch. They want to get out there and do things. So they're part of this. The fire's still burning in them.
Right.
Then for an illustration, I don't know if it helps or it confounds the whole thing, but kind of the old thing where you give a man a fish and he's not hungry that night, but you teach him to fish, he'll never be hungry again. Kind of fits on this. If you teach kids how to fish, they're going to continue to be able to feed themselves as they go.
yes, oh, that's a good one. It's like a saying,
Yeah.
an illustration, yeah.
Yeah, that works.
That works.
Great. Rick.
Well, the elaboration is similar to what people said. Kind of don't just state the facts when you're teaching. You try to inspire curiosity and a desire to learn in your students. Example, well, I do think about that. You can only teach so much factual information in 3 hours. So I may talk about how it's important for a therapist to know about their own family background in order to be more sensitive in their work. And an illustration of lighting the fire would be if people hear that, or maybe hear me give an example of that, and then go out and do some family history study of their own so they can apply it to themselves, even though it's not like a required assignment.
I see. The fire was lit and they wanted to
Yeah, they want to
get it. Wow.
It's not because it's going to be in the
Oh.
test. I'm not going to ask
Yeah,
about the family
iron
test,
on.
but yeah.
Great. That's great.
Or some people will write a paper about their family background based on what they already know, and other people will call up somebody and do some research and stuff. And if the fire's been lit, they'll kind of
Right.
get interested in it.
Great. Anybody else want to share? Should we go on? We have it's a 10 to 1.
So we have to, only one? Oh,
Yeah.
why was I thinking 1:30? Oh, no. Ah,
Well,
okay. So this, I could at least begin to tell, okay, that's a shame. I wanted to spend more time. I was thinking 1:30. Ah. Okay. Well, as you saw in the toolbox, we had the elements of reasoning, which are the parts of thinking of all human beings as they figure something out. The intellectual standards, which are universal because they operate all the time. You never want to be the opposite of any of these in your thinking. And you could apply these to how you're doing a purpose or a question. You see they work that way. But then, actually, what happens as a natural outcome, to think of it that way, is as you actually practice doing that, you're actually in the process of developing intellectual traits. Because this is a fair-minded thinker who's really trying to look at different points of view, look at their own assumptions, and see if they're fair, if they're I mean, if one is trying to do this, and we're all on ranges and different issues and so on, if one who's sincerely trying to do this as they figure out life and anything, is developing intellectual integrity, trying to be accurate, intellectual humility, seeing if their assumptions, in fact, may be baseless. And if their point of view really needs to be examined differently in light of maybe a completely contrary point of view. Actually, what we were going to have you do, which we don't have time, would be to have you define each of those terms for yourself, intellectual integrity, we certainly don't have time for that. We probably don't even have time for the next thing. Then we attached on pages 11 through 15, actually again from that Critical Thinking Competency Standards, a little pamphlet I showed you last week, standards 10 through 17 are actually the development of each of these intellectual traits. And you could see then how they define each of these traits. Performance indicators and dispositions, they elaborate it, and then they actually give you some outcomes that you would be looking for in the thinker, yourself or the students, to be developing. My question for you, maybe we have enough time to do this. Pick one of the standards. 10 is fair-mindedness, 11 is intellectual humility. See how they define it real briefly, and create an activity that you would do in the class where you're consciously having the students do some little practice of that kind of trait. See, I mean, and it's different. You can say, well, I do these kind of things, but when you're consciously doing it, so you do that kind of activity, like let's say Mike or John talked about the activities they come up with. Well, maybe that shows intellectual integrity, because they're really trying to use accurate information as they do the case study of this individual or whatever. So see if you can think of the activity you would do that develops a particular trait. Because we want them to develop these traits, and it's not done by preaching at them. Be good. No, they actually have to work with it, and in a very real way of just the content they do in the class, the way they function, the way they approach thinking about things. That's how they'll develop it. You certainly don't have a heck of a lot of time to go over it. I'll tell you, if anybody got an idea right off the bat.
I got one.
Okay, Jerry, which one?
15, intellectual perseverance.
Okay, intellectual perseverance.
And what popped into my mind was when I taught sophomores in high school biology, and I'd call on them and they'd say, I don't know.
Right.
I trained them real fast, that I didn't just leave and go to someone else. My statement continued to be until they immediately knew what I was going to say. I'd always say, you've been on this planet for 16 years and you have an answer. It's somewhere inside you. And eventually they developed this intellectual perseverance. I have an answer inside me. I have been on this planet for 16 years. I've learned a lot of things, and I come up with an answer, right, wrong, or indifferent, but I can come up with an answer.
And it's a step. Right.
It was a beginning, at least.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
So that would be, and just that approach, he's helping them develop. You can see in a typical day and a typical lesson in Jerry's class, one is actually consciously developing intellectual perseverance.
Well, in the end, if I asked a question, every kid that I ever asked always had an answer. It was maybe not the best answer in the world, but they always had an answer.
Right.
How about 12?
Okay.
Courage.
Yes.
Something I do with my students is I split the room in half and I pick a hot button topic. And then I have one half debate one side, another half debate the other side, and then I flip-flop. And they get a chance to see both frames of thinking and separate their own opinion from it.
Right. That's at the having somebody stand in opposing points of view would be developing intellectual courage. A, that you're not going to be crushed, your whole belief system will not fall apart because I'm asking you to examine it and perhaps argue from that point of view. And B, you could have the courage to have your point of view, which is distinctly different, even if several around are different. So intellectual courage is an important thing, and it shows that they don't need to knuckle under or be afraid, but stand up for it, and also be open to learning something new, and the courage that, if I learn something, I'm ready to incorporate it. I tell you, oh, okay.
All right.
Bring them here. No.
Well.
We're going to be here till 3. No, wait. If you turn to page 16, I wish we did more with the intellectual traits, but actually they are an outcome of students functioning with these. But it's nice to know that we are doing things, we're consciously having them, like Jerry pointed out. They were really conscious. That's a strong value for you, intellectual perseverance. And actually, if you look at all these other virtues and read that, you'll see, where can I consciously accentuate that and know I'm doing that? Well, look at page 16. the object of teaching a child or a young person or anybody is to enable the child to get along without the teacher. Okay? So you need to build the quality of their mind and their thinking, and when you're not there, that would be putting them on a path for lifelong learning. They could raise vital questions and look for information which is relevant and accurate. And they know how to do that, not only vis-a-vis math or sociology or management science, but even the issues in life. And then another one, we have to understand life as a school to understand the role schools can play in life. And which relates to the very next page. One overarching way of assessing our relationship here is, well, you have purposes for the activity you're doing in the class. You should be able to articulate, at least in your mind, and ideally the students too, well, how does that relate to the purpose of why we're studying this unit or topic? Often those connections are not, couldn't even tell you the first one other than it's on a test. Okay? And how does that relate to why we're studying this course? And how does that relate to why we go to school? And how does that relate to why we're becoming educated and wanting to learn? And how does that relate to why we're living a life? I mean, you don't do that for every darn topic, but where there is that connection, where that sense of purpose cutting through, I think that brings whatever is being done much more alive, as opposed to, we barely know the purpose of the activity, and it's for some, purpose to get a few points for a grade.
It's nice to think that through once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while. At least like the first 3, 4 at the bottom going up, I think from a student's point of view. And one last handout, sorry. So we can give this to Al. Just keep in mind as you do all of this, that learning is multidimensional. And whatever the it is that you want them to learn that day or over that period of time, it's much more valuable if the students are engaged in a variety of ways. Listening is considerably the most passive. And it's better that, so you think of, I have a topic I want them to learn about today. How can I engage them in reading about it, writing about it, speaking about it, listening to it, assessing it, questioning it, applying it, doing it, teaching it? To the extent you could do those things over a period of time, the students' minds are far more engaged than the mere expectation of sitting there passively taking in by listening to it because the teacher must know, the book must know, and then I give it back. Truly wanting them to learn it would engage all of these, and these would be tools, the intellectual tools, for helping assist in doing that. Thank you.